So we're going to a different screen format since I'm posting these on YouTube. So we're going to horizontal, so I guess you're holding your phone sideways. We're going on to chapter 2. I know on a lot of screens these are too small to read the caption, so I will read the caption. And this end is called the Thagomizer, after the late Thag Simmons. And of course, these guys didn't live with those guys, but it's a cartoon. The basic idea here is human beings, they see something, they got to put a name on it. Is that we are unrepentant labelers. And we not only like to name things, but then we like to know how this thing is connected to that thing. The same way we want to know how this person is connected to us or connected to this other person we know. We're always looking for relationships because our whole society works upon relationships. And that's what this chapter is about. It's about taxonomy, which is the technical term. The older term is classification. Taxonomy. So, it's very nice if you have your own pet insects to give them all little names like Ned and Jerry and Bob and Linda. But nobody's going to know what kind of insect you're talking about just because it's Linda. The first expression to learn in any foreign language is, I'm sorry, I don't speak your language. Eventually to, I don't speak your language very well. And as science developed from the Renaissance up, you had a lot of countries in Europe. This is science is kind of a Western invention with input from the East and from the Middle East and from the Far East, especially the Middle East for numbers and how numbers work. But anyway, lots of countries, lots of different languages. Lots of people interested in how the world worked in what we now call biology, and realizing that what we call this animal is a different word than what they call the animal somewhere else. What we call this plant is different. What we call this type of rock is different. So it was kind of settled that they were going to share information with a common language. And then the question was, what language is that? Well, educated people through that era virtually always took classes in Latin and Greek. And for the most part, they agreed when they published things, they wrote up materials to be published so other people in other countries could read them, they would do it in Latin. So Latin became, for a very long time, the common language of science. And that persisted into the 20th century. When I went into science long, long ago, it was greatly suggested that you take a language that a lot of science was being written in. At that point, it was German and Russian. That's no longer the case. I would assume now that people are being gently prodded to take Chinese, at least written Chinese, because there's a tremendous amount of research being published in China. There's issues with the research being published in China, but there's a lot of it out there. And if you want to read in its original form, and there may not be any translated forms, then you need a familiarity with the languages that people are talking about. But we're kind of back to where we were, where different countries are publishing in their own languages. Although across Europe, it's still very, very common to publish in English. English has, to some extent, become the common language of science. A lot of Chinese research is published in English. So Latin. We get to a guy named Carl von Linné, who, now anytime I tell you one of these stories, it always turns out like with Francesco Redi and Sciences and a lot of other things. There often will be one person that's kind of representative of a movement, because he did a very important contribution, and we kind of connect him to a lot of big things in it. But it's science. There's no one person that does everything when something major is put together, like taxonomy, like a classification system. But Carl von Linné, or who he wrote as, people that do this sort of thing are very, very structured, verging on OCD, if not completely OCD people. And he published as Carolus Linnaeus, because he not only wrote in Latin, he Latinized his own name when he wrote in Latin. And he got very focused on how do we name this stuff and show the relationships. We connect him with the idea of a name for species, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. That's kind of based on how people's names work, although backwards from the European version, more like the Asian version, where you got two words. One word connects you to their family, to their bigger group, and one word is specific to them. Kind of like the Screen Actors Guild. You can't have two people in the Screen Actors Guild alive with the same first and last name. Is that they want it to be very specific, and Linnaeus said, we'll do that with species names too. It's going to be two words, and they're going to be unique to any particular species, the two of them together. Now this is what they call an hierarchical system, where you start big, and then you get smaller. And you get smaller, 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 and you get more specific as you go. So there'd be one species inside a genus, which may have one or a whole bunch of species in it. Genera, which is the plural, would be inside a family, inside an order, inside a class, inside a phylum, inside a kingdom, inside a domain. And there at the bottom, they've got the list of 3 domains. So, now, when I first learned this, the domain was not an agreed upon, recognized group. It may be back on its way to not being, there's some question as to whether the domains are a valid collection. And it may be simpler just to go back to the starting at the kingdom. But since the domains didn't exist, I learned King Philip came over for ginger snaps. Even then, nobody ate ginger snaps, but King Philip came over from Germany slowly. There's a link in the book, I think, to about 80 different ways to remember this order, something, what they call a mnemonic. But these groups get, more containing as you go up the ladder. Is it species inside genera, inside families, inside orders, inside classes? You get the basic idea. So it's hierarchical, big, smaller, 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 hierarchy. Now you run into a problem here, is that it's science and people will fiddle with it. They will disagree. They'll go, you've got 2 groups classified in this one class. I don't think they belong together in the class. And, but I don't think that I want to make orders out of them. What do you do? Okay. There's a fudge factor group, or groups. You can take any group and produce a subgroup. Is that you got, say, 2 groups within the class that you think are, need to be separated out a little bit more, but you still want them within the class. So you put them in a subclass this, subclass that. The example I like to use is within the orders. There's this classic question of the order Chiroptera, which is the bats. There are microbats, Microcoroptera, the little guys who have sonar and fly around at night eating bugs, and the Macrocoroptera, the larger bats that fly around sometimes at night, sometimes not, usually without anything even resembling sonar, and they typically eat fruits, the fruit bats. And they're typically considered to be suborders within the order Chiroptera. Depending on, some people think they're not that related, that they should be in separate orders. Some people think that, that they should be in their own order inside a superorder Chiroptera, which links things that don't necessarily belong all together, but they sort of belong all together. But it's a way of fudging the listing. So between a phylum and a class, you can have subphylums and superclasses. Between the classes and the orders, you can have subclasses and superorders. Is that anytime you put sub on something, you're taking that level and giving you something smaller, sub, under. Anytime you have a super anything, you've taken that group and made it something bigger. Look at Superman, bigger, higher. But it's a way of fiddling with the groups, which brings us to the idea when you disagree, that's supposed to be a D. When you disagree, there's things you can do and things you're not supposed to do. You can suggest that the Chiroptera be split into super orders and say from now on, that is the way I'm going to discuss them in all my papers. Superorder, Chiroptera, order, Microcoroptera, order, Macrocoroptera. And you may have noticed, what I didn't get a chance to do is I couldn't take a name on the list and just change it. I couldn't say, I'm not calling them Chiroptera anymore, I'm calling them Batty, Batty, Batty. And because then you lose the common language, is people know what the group names are, and that happens, you'll read a paper and you'll see the group and you go, Porifera as a class? Is that I'm used to Porifera as a kingdom, I'm used to Porifera as a phylum. This person seems to think that Porifera, which is the sponges. See, the thing is, you read Porifera, you know, okay, those are the sponges. And you just kind of shrug and go, oh, okay, they must have some reason that they think it's a different group, but I know what group they're talking about. I can keep reading this paper because I know we're talking about sponges here. So you can't arbitrarily change the names. Names do get changed occasionally. Usually it's a pain in the butt to change the names. You have to get a whole group together and petition a special group that used to be in London. I think it's in Geneva now. And then it gets confusing because you pick up a book and what are now called the Cnidaria in an old book are called the Coelenterata. What are now called the apicomplexans in an old book were called the Sporozoa. When you get into some of the plant groups, some of the fungal groups, there's a disagreement enough that some of the names haven't completely worked their way through the system. So you'll see the same group called 2 or 3 different names, and it does get confusing. And the idea of the rules is supposed to kind of help get around that. Bugs at a cocktail party, as you would have. And I know the captions here are not easy to read on a little screen, so think about it, Ed. The class Insecta, that class should be actually capitalized. The class Insecta contains 26 orders, almost 1,000 families, over 750,000 described species, but I can't shake the feeling we're all just a bunch of bugs. I used to have a professor, one of the orders of insects is called Hemiptera, and in common parlance they are called the true bugs. And my entomology professor did not like it when I referred to insects as bugs unless they were hemipterans. She goes, no, those are orthopterans, those are not hemipterans. Johnson, back off. It's an Armandia litterdali, all right, but it's rabid. Little butterfly foaming at the mouth. This brings us to another major concept that we connect to Linnaeus, and that is species names. And there are definite rules for species names. This is called binomial two-name nomenclature, which is kind of fancy for two-name naming. This is specifically for species names. They are two words. If you're going to abbreviate them, you abbreviate by abbreviating the first word to its initial. You always write it out the first time you use it in anything that you're writing, unless it's one of those names that everybody knows that way. You all know a species name that's abbreviated this way, and it's what you hope you don't get from your hamburger. E. coli. E stands for Escherichia, which is why nobody wants to spell it out. And coli of the colon, it's a bacterium that lives in the colons of lots and lots and lots of different animals, but there's a lot of different strains, and very often the strain you can get from beef doesn't really get along with the strains that you have in your own colon, and they'll give you all sorts of issues. But that's how you abbreviate the whole thing. The first word is the genus. That's the level above the species. Species are contained within a genus. Plural is genera, because it's Latin. So you take that, it's like our family names connect us to our group. That's our second name in our way of speaking, but Linnaeus flipped it around. And it is always capitalized. Second word is never capitalized. This is a very common mistake that you see, where both words will get capitalized. The cartoon that I had up is an actual butterfly species. I don't know that for a fact, but I'll tell you why I'm pretty sure. Armandia litterdalii was the species name. Litterdahl is a very famous entomologist. He named lots and lots and lots and lots of species, and very often you'll name a species after somebody and use their name. Now, the litterdalii was somebody's name. You still don't get to capitalize it. And an unwritten, unofficial rule is that Litterdahl wouldn't have named species after himself. So anything named litterdalii was probably named by somebody in honor of Litterdahl. People do get around that by saying, you know, like Litterdahl might go, yeah, I named it after my wife, her name's Litterdahl too, or my son, his name's Litterdahl too. So, as I said, it's a fuzzy, unwritten rule, but typically you're not supposed to name stuff after yourself. You can name stuff after places. If you're in the lab, we have little lizards called anoles. The species name is Anolis corolliensis. It's named after the Carolinas where they were first described. And again, you can't capitalize the Latin version of the Carolinas because it's never capitalized. E. coli of the colon. Coli, since there's a whole bunch of stuff that lives or is related to colons, is a very common second word. You can use it over and over and over again, just like we can use our first names over and over and over again. My name's Michael. Used to be that I couldn't be in a room and be the only Michael in the room because there's just so many people my age named Michael. It's gotten a little rarer now, except now when I go fence in my old person groups at the Nationals, I'll be in a group of 6 and there'll be at least another Michael in the 6 of us because we're all old guys and Michael's a really common old name. But none of them have my last name. None of them have my genus name. So it's easy to tell who's who. But that's the rule, is that species names are 2 words. You can abbreviate them as long as you write them out the first time. The first word has 2 rules. You use the genus, you always capitalize it. The second word has 2 rules, you never capitalize it. And it doesn't mean anything by itself. is it always has to be linked to the genus name to be that species. Because sometimes people go, that second word, that's the species. No, it's not. Confusingly, some people do technically call it the specific, but I think that's more confusing than it's worth, and there's no reason why you need to know that, except I just told you. Sorry, I'm leaning in here to see how far in we are. Okay, I'm gonna stop at this point and pick up the second half of this with another video.